welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into something pretty fascinating. We've got two of the world's most advanced countries, right? America and Japan. And it turns out a decision one of them made decades ago created this huge, almost invisible split in how their cities and even their economies work today. So here's the big question we're tackling. Why did America basically do a U-turn on its love affair with the car, while Japan just kept on driving down that same road? And this is really the heart of it. You see, for a while there in the mid-20th century, they were on the exact same page, building these sprawling, car-friendly cities and suburbs. But then something changed. America slammed on the brakes, but Japan, they kept the pedal to the metal, chasing this vision of an American dream that, ironically, America itself was starting to question.
Okay, so to really get what's going on, we first need to rewind and look at the American story. It's all about its relationship with the car, which totally transformed the country, not just once, but twice.
You know, it might actually surprise you to hear this, but way before the car became king, American cities were all about public transit. They had these things called streetcar suburbs. It was the original model, really. Walkable neighborhoods, all connected by trolleys. This proves that living just outside the city center isn't some new idea. What is new is being completely dependent on a car to do it. So you can see America went through this pretty wild cycle. First, it was a world leader in cities built for people and transit. Then, bam, the 1950s hit, and it went all in on the automobile, which gave us the sprawl we all know. But then people started to notice the downside. And by the 1970s, a real movement began to push back and try to reverse course. And yet, this big change wasn't just some line on a graph. It was driven by real people. People who looked around and saw their downtowns dying and felt isolated in the suburbs, and they just said, hey, we can do better than this. This quote, it's really about activists like Jane Jacobs, who basically stood up and said, hold on, cities are for people, not just for traffic. And that idea, it sparked a whole movement that we now call New Urbanism.
All right, so while America is having this massive rethink about how its cities should work, Japan's story takes a completely different turn. Or maybe it's better to say it didn't turn at all.
See, Japan jumped on that 1950s American bandwagon with incredible enthusiasm. It built its whole modern economy around the car. But here's the crucial part. It totally missed the memo about the U-turn. It just kept doubling down on that car-centric model, right at the same time the country that invented it was having some serious regrets.
So what happens when you do that? When a whole country builds its modern cities for cars instead of for people? Well, it creates a very specific, very modern problem. One that just wasn't a thing back when cities were designed around how far a person could walk.
And that problem is what we now call the last mile problem. Think about it. In the past, a town just ended where the trolley line ended. Simple. If you couldn't walk to it, it wasn't really part of the town. But now, with all this car-focused sprawl, you get these huge, empty gaps between where people live, where they work, and the nearest train or bus stop. And let's be clear, this isn't a failure of public transit. No, it's a direct consequence of designing our world for cars and forgetting about the human scale.
Now, this huge decision, this fork in the road, wasn't just about how cities look or feel. It came with a massive and mostly hidden economic price tag. And you can see it plain as day in some really surprising data.
Yeah, this split didn't just change the vibe of a city. It had this staggering cost. It really boils down to this one number, 8. So what's so special about the number 8? Well, it represents a massive gap in productivity, and in a sector you might not immediately think of.
Okay, just look at this chart. It's pretty stark. We're talking about freight transport productivity here. What it means is that for every ton of stuff a logistics worker in Japan moves over a kilometer, a worker in the US moves nearly 8 times more. That's not a small rounding error. That is a gigantic gap in efficiency, and it's tied directly back to all those decisions about building infrastructure for cars instead of for efficient commerce.
And this isn't just a story about highways versus side streets. It goes deeper, right into policy that's been in place for decades. While the US and Europe were largely deregulating their transportation industries to stir up competition and efficiency, Japan took a different path. It privatized many systems, sure, but it often left a lot of the old restrictive regulations in place. The result? A market that's just less competitive and less efficient. But you know what? After looking at all these huge systemic problems, the story doesn't just end there. It actually zooms right back in, from the national level down to the local. And it's there, on the ground, that we might be seeing the very first signs of a Japanese U-turn.
So over in a place called Shiga Prefecture, a grassroots movement is basically saying, we're not going to wait for the government to fix this. There's this group called Yasashi Kotsu Shiga, which means gentle transportation Shiga, and they're putting regular citizens right at the heart of the conversation, trying to rethink mobility from the ground up.
And they're not just sitting around talking. They're out there doing real work. They're exploring how to turn sleepy train stations back into lively community hubs. They're holding forums, asking people what actually makes a city a great place to live. And they're creating workshops to connect everyday folks with students and experts. They're essentially asking the very same question that America started asking back in the 70s, what kind of community do we really want to live in?
And that really leaves us with this powerful final thought. We've seen how history, policy, and decades of planning set Japan on its current path. But the question now is, can the will of the people, working together in their own towns and neighborhoods, be strong enough to steer the whole country onto a new road? That's the real divergence to watch for now.